Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with Andy Lipson, and our guest here we have Will, a high school science teacher and former naval officer that will be sharing with us his personal political journey and military experience. But today we'll be focusing on the evolution of how he has slowly come from was it a liberal background, Will, or?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll just say here that your journey in your in your own political evolution, that you will be sharing with us, which is, I think, of interest to us, especially since you have a very diverse background in what you'll be sharing with us in part 1 and part 2 of this episode. But first of all, I'm very curious as to how you both, this connection that you and Andy have, so that you can share with us and our audience, because I think it's something I didn't even know that was happening behind the scenes.
Yes. So I don't fully remember how we got in touch with each other, but you'll clarify that. But I do know that you contacted me by Facebook, and I know that you know another comrade of mine, or former comrade from the ISO, and the big impression that came from me is, I think you said, you agreed with something I had written, or maybe it was something What's Left or something like that. But we got a chance to talk on the phone, and just your political journey from liberal to anarchist to socialist, and all happening in North Carolina, was very interesting to me. And I know we talked on the phone about, how to best do the science teacher thing, So that's what I remember, and it just left a big impression, particularly by the fact that you had also had an experience in the military and thoughts about that. I told Eduardo, I said, we have to interview this guy and, get his story out here, because I think it's very interesting. So that's as much as I remember, but maybe you can fill us in on that.
Yeah, so that was through the Socialist Educators Facebook group. So yeah, I listened to you posted one of your episodes from What's Left on there, and I found it really interesting. I can't remember what episode it was, but so I reached out and just I forget why I reached out, but just to start a conversation. Oh, it was mainly about, because I remember you mentioned you were a science teacher, and I was like, I'm a science teacher. I need to talk to this guy. and so we ended up talking on the phone a little bit, but yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm honored to be on the show. I really enjoy listening. I think your show is unique because, you're two people from different political perspectives, and you often debate each other, which I think is really cool, because it's something that we need to learn how to do, is disagree with each other respectfully, and especially to be friends while you're debating. Like, that's huge. So a lot of people are not even capable of doing that. It's difficult to, maintain friendships, despite disagreements about, big things. And also the topics you cover are fascinating. The guests you have are really interesting, especially since, your guests are, relationships with you in the workplace, which is also very rare. So I'm excited to be on the show and talk about my experience, because naturally I think my experience is interesting.
I like that, Will.
So maybe first, would you say if I was to do it in a single sentence, I would say you went from liberal to anarchist to socialist. And we want to trace all that out, but is that roughly right?
Yeah, that's right, except I would say the main transformation was liberal to anarchist. And these categories, they can be very confusing and sometimes obscure more than they illuminate. And in the case of anarchism and socialism, I see them as synonymous. For example, Adolf Fischer, one of the Haymarket martyrs, said that every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is an anarchist. And while that may have been true in his time, I don't know if that's really true today. I mean, anarchism is such a huge word. Just like socialism, it covers a broad array of perspectives. So I guess I would say I'm a socialist anarchist, and the word that I most frequently use is libertarian socialist, which just means that I'm a socialist who opposes state mediation or just going through the state to get to something else.
Okay.
But yeah, the categories are very confusing, and I try to avoid the labels, but sometimes I just say socialist, especially nowadays, because socialism it's a big touchstone.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you were, I mean, tell us about your background. How did you were liberal? I mean, you're in North Carolina.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to the way people will understand it. Sorry about that. North Carolina, yeah.
And maybe also just like what from your background do you think would help us understand your political journey? Just for anything.
Yeah, because it's a conservative state.
Right. Okay, yeah.
So I'm just curious, what's your background? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, all right, I guess the first thing is I grew up in a privileged family, not just white privilege, but I'm, upper middle class professionals. My granddad was a lawyer. He was a lawyer for Norfolk Southern, the railroad company. My grandmother, I think she always said they had a white trash background. And they basically married into money. So, there's an interesting mix there. So a privileged background, but I was always kind of a misfit in the sort of upper middle class way of life. My dad's side of the family is Cuban, so my dad's from New York. Both of his parents immigrated from Cuba in 1949, which was before the revolution. But they were also from, I would say, an upper middle class background. So they were all doctors. My dad's dad was a psychiatrist, and he actually was an army officer who helped rehabilitate Cuban refugees after the revolution, I'm pretty sure, which is an interesting tidbit. I can't remember the name of the fort that he was stationed at when he did that, but upper middle class background on both sides, but also diverse with the Cuban. My mom's side is, white Anglo-Saxon. My dad's Cuban. So anyway, I never really fit in. I did horribly in school. I basically failed every grade, but I got advanced. I went to the private school that my family had gone to, where all the rich people in Charlotte send their kids. But I flunked out of there and ended up going to public school for the rest of high school. And ended up joining the Navy, and I enlisted because I was fed up with school. I didn't want to go to college. Considered it to become an officer, but I was like, I just want to see the world and serve my country, because I was very much into sort of that mythology about the patriotic mythology about doing your part to defend the freedom of United States citizens. My family, at least on my mom's side, was very liberal. I would say like a critical thinking sort of liberal, and almost like less liberal, I would say. But there's a huge mix of ideas in there. Like my grandma, I think she read a lot of Civil War history, and like Shelby Foote, who is like sort of a lost cause, like Southern historian. So there was like there's a big mix of ideas. Like they were liberal, but they would watch the PBS McNeil News Hour and shout at the TV all night. And it's interesting because I was going through my grandparents' library, and they had books about the Bolshevik Revolution, and they have like all of Studs Terkel's books, which I don't know if you know Studs Terkel. Yeah. He's like a kind of a liberal, like closet communist who did like a lot of great work with. And so I ended up like my grandma gave me like Studs Terkel's books for like Christmas and stuff, and so I grew up reading that sort of thing, and it gave me like a big sort of habit of critical thinking, I would say. And so anyway, but I was still like a liberal, I would say I was like kind of elitist, paternalistic sort of mentality, probably racist, although, I was definitely against like the racism of my grandma, which was more pronounced. So I enlisted in the Navy, and that was like a huge wake-up call because, while I went to public school, and I mingled with people from all backgrounds in public school, it's really different when you join the Navy because you're living with these people and you're having to work with them. Whereas school, you're sitting next to them in the classroom, but when you go to eat lunch, you're sitting with people from your own class background. Well, when I enlisted, just a huge wake-up call, and just like it was a culture shock, honestly, to enlist, because I was immersed in working class culture. I mean, the vast majority of people who enlist in the Navy don't do it for any branch of the military. They don't do it for patriotic reasons. They do it for economic reasons. When we went around the room in boot camp, saying our reasons for joining, it was like I was like one of two out of maybe 50 people who joined for patriotic reasons. And at the time, I thought, well, these people are just, they're selfish, they're not selfless like I am. And I mean, that was kind of my mentality, and over time, like I would say over the next 10 years, I would slowly learn that I was the fool for believing all the mythology of patriotism. And so I enlisted, and I had all these sort of these patriotic ideas, and I was motivated by them for a long time. And shortly after I went to boot camp, it was August. I went to boot camp August of 2001, and obviously September 11th happened, about a month later. And so I was in boot camp when that happened, and there were rumors flying about, well, they were going to end our training early and ship us right off to Afghanistan and all kinds of crazy stuff, and I didn't have any kind of idea what was going on. Like, it was just like I knew about like the attack on the USS Cole, which I don't know if you guys remember that. That was a year prior. But I didn't know anything about why this stuff was happening. I had no political or historical knowledge whatsoever. That's true of most people. So I was asking, my mom to like send me books and stuff to help me understand what was happening, because I knew these people were attacking for a reason, and I wanted to know, what was their motivation. And when George Bush went on TV and said he was going to invade Afghanistan, it was like, why are we sending, fighter jets and bombers to attack this small group of people who's orchestrating this from several different countries? And it was just like, it was mind-boggling for me. Like, I'm sure, like I know it was for almost everybody, but everyone I talked to was just like, no one seemed to really care. No one had the questions like I did. I guess I would say it's because people are just, nobody believed in it, and it was like I was the only one who was like, what's going on? Like, I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the course of several years, I was grappling with this question of why is this happening? And I believed at the time that it was just a dumb president making a bad decision that was going to exacerbate the problem. And when I went on deployment 6 months later, after my training, I went on to become an electronic warfare technician, which is sort of like you analyze radar signals and make sure they're not missiles. I was stationed on a carrier. So we deployed in the fall of March 2002, or the fall of 2002. The shock and awe campaign of 2003 happened while we were out to sea. We were out to sea for 90 days. And again, I was like, what the hell is going on? What does Iraq have to do with Osama bin Laden? And it was like Colin Powell making his speech, and Bush making his speech about Saddam having ties with Al Qaeda. It was just like, it did not hold any water. Like, I wasn't a radical or anything. It was just like, this is not making any sense. And it just seemed like a pretext, I guess. And I didn't understand. It seemed like they just wanted to invade Iraq, and this was like an excuse. And again, I wasn't reading anything useful at the time. It was just like what I was watching on TV was not making sense. And by the way, we had Fox News on 24/7 in the watch room, and it was driving me insane to watch these pundits glorify war, and it was terrible. So in March 2003, my ship was sending planes out to Iraq from the Mediterranean to bomb targets in Iraq, and it was like I was only finding out from the news the very night that happened. I only knew it happened because I was watching Fox News, which was bizarre. So that compartmentalization of knowledge, I think is underestimated. Like, we only have our little piece of the puzzle, and most of us don't have the full picture. And so, we're bombing Iraq, and then we get back from the deployment. Maybe it was like May or something, after the initial bombing and invasion, and I watched the narrative switch very suddenly from ties with Al Qaeda and what was the other one? Weapons of mass destruction. Switch from that to giving Iraq democracy.
Right.
And we dropped this banner at the homecoming when we pulled into port amid the cheering crowd of parents and families, including my dad and stepmom. We dropped a huge banner that said, "We gave them freedom," which I thought was pretty ironic because the ship's motto is "Give them hell," and they basically took that slogan, that motto, and they just basically changed it to "We gave them freedom." So it was like, it's like a tacit admission that our version of freedom is hell.
Right. That's
yeah. So I guess I just gave away what ship I was on, but yeah, it was the USS Harry S. Truman. But
I thought you were going to say you were on that mission accomplished ship, because that was another one, right?
Yeah. Which one was that? That was Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, the one that Bush landed on.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. There were several carriers. We were launching planes 24/7. It was unbelievable. But but yeah, so again, I know I'm spending a lot of time on this.
Take your
You're
time.
fine.
Tell me to
You're
speed up
fine.
if you need me to, but
This is
okay.
this is all about you today.
Okay.
Definitely.
So yeah, but I was still liberal. I thought, this is just a dumb administration making bad decisions. And I remember in 2003 watching the TV and seeing Senator Obama making a speech against the invasion, and I was like, it was just an incredibly moving speech, and I was just like, hell yeah, like, I love this guy. I want him to be president. And I had no idea he was going to run for president. I'm sure a lot of people were saying the same thing. And, but yeah, it was just a great speech. And he was just hitting the nail on the head and in a very eloquent way. And so, I was a liberal. And I was still trying to read stuff. And some of the books that I came across, if you were to go to Barnes and Noble or some, mainstream bookstore to try to understand what's going on, of course you're going to get these racist right-wing views. And the books that I was reading, were sort of pathologizing the quote-unquote Arab mind, which is, I can't remember who wrote that book, but it's called The Arab Mind, and it's supposed to explain like terrorism in terms of like Arab pathologies, and it's just incredibly racist. And there's other books like Bernard Lewis, sort of like these pro-Western civilization narratives, and but they didn't really hold a lot of water for me. I don't know why, but it just didn't make a lot of sense. Like I was looking for something that made sense, and over time, let's see, and I never once in my entire life did I come across anything radical, like no radical literature. I never met anybody who was a radical, which is kind of surprising, how long that the left has been around. Mm-hmm. I think once during a parade at the Naval Academy, I'm getting ahead of myself now, but there were some protesters, but I didn't understand what they were saying. Something about Israel. And I found them kind of off-putting because they were yelling at us, and I thought they just didn't like us. I didn't understand. But that was, so anyway, but fast forward, I did another deployment, and I'm getting more salty, I'm getting kind of bitter, and not just at foreign policy issues, but I'm bitter about the internal culture of the military, the way that sailors are treated by senior enlisted and officers. I kind of came to realize that upper ranks are really self-seeking and kind of backbiting people, and the number of leaders in the enlisted and officer ranks who actually advocate for their sailors, as opposed to just being yes men, are just very few and far between. I mean, that's more common in the enlisted ranks, but I came to have this theory that, the people who say yes, the people who basically roger up to exploiting the people below them, are the ones who get promoted. And, if you say no, then you don't get promoted. And I mean, that's just kind of a simple observation, but that kind of, sort of theory that I developed, that ends up being a very radical idea, the idea that yes men get promoted, willing to have principles and act on those principles, they don't. And so I got tired of being treated like a kid, and being treated, like crap, because enlisted ranks, you're really exploited and abused. Obviously, these are people who come from lower socioeconomic status of society and do the dirty work. And So eventually, somewhere along the line, I got the idea in my head to become an officer because I thought I would be a better, advocate for sailors. And I ended up applying to the Naval Academy twice. First time I didn't get in because of my grades. Second time I got in because I had an advocate because of family connection. Honestly, it was a family connection. My dad was a doctor who knew a nurse who knew my boss, and he requested that I come work with him in this kind of cush job. I ended up getting high marks in my application to the Naval Academy, and so I ended up getting the Naval Academy. That was 2005, and I was pretty salty at this point. I was old for a midshipman, or the same as a cadet, a student officer.
How old were you at
I was
the
pretty
time?
bitter
You said you were old.
and salty about. I was at 22, almost 23, which is right at the age limit for midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And the Naval Academy is ridiculous. I could spend some time talking about that too.
We're going to talk about that next time.
Okay. Oh man, I'm really indicting myself, but yeah. So I went from privileged background to a very working class background, and then back to a privileged background. So it really gave me a strong sense of the contrast, the cultural contrast, and the experiences of people in those kind of strata. In the Naval Academy, it was, in a way, it was familiar from my, childhood days. But I also found it very alienating because I had become used to the working class culture, which I would say is more. I don't want to generalize too much because obviously working class is not monolithic. It's incredibly diverse. But I would say on the whole, I just found enlisted life, people were very gregarious, selfless, open-hearted. People wear their heart on their sleeve. Even think people might have bigoted views, but they're very sort of quick to embrace each other. And that was an important experience in my life because I learned that you spend enough time with anybody and you understand them and you can learn to like them. And that doesn't matter who it is. And but when I went to the Naval Academy, I found the culture very alienating, kind of elitist. People were just kind of, just elitist, because these are people who are the creme de la creme. They come from the same sort of background that I did. You have to get congressional nominations to get to the Naval Academy. It's incredibly competitive, just like Harvard or Yale. From the enlisted side, it's less competitive. So I kind of got into the back door that way. I'd say the biggest, filter for enlisted people is just, the fact that you can't have been married, you can't drink for the first year. It's like a prison for 4 years, and most enlisted guys just don't want to go through that. They can't take that sort of constraint. And they have financial obligations. They have to help their families out. They might have kids. They might have parents who depend on income, and you don't have an income for those 4 years. So, anyways, I'm digressing a lot. So anyway, I went to the Naval Academy. I became an officer, and I went to my first ship, and I was, still heavily deluded. I thought that I was going to be this unique officer who actually advocated for their sailors, and I quickly learned that that I had heavy constraints on my freedom to advocate, and I learned which side of the bread, the butter is on. Yeah, I learned that either you say yes or you're going to be replaced. And so I think people who don't have that experience in middle management, who've never been a boss, think that you can be that you can be a good boss, and I just I learned that you can't. If you're going to rise up in the ranks, you better be ready to leave your scruples at the door. I mean, to a certain extent. I mean, yes, there's a range, there's a spectrum there. I mean, you can be better. You don't have to be completely depraved, but it's not like you're going to change the world. And there are institutions that you're just going to have to abide by, and you're not going to even be able to speak, against those institutions. I had a couple of every captain I had in the Navy was sort of tyrannical, and I would watch them transform from a sort of a good XO to sort of a tyrannical CO. The XO is like a second in command, and the CO is the unit's commanding officer. And yeah. Anyways, and I would watch people, get promoted and kind of become like a different person. As we had in the officer community, you talk about the decision to go from a division officer, which is like a junior officer, to a department head, which is sort of like a career officer. And you talk about that like drinking the Kool-Aid or selling your soul, and because you're kind of like, taking that final step into, buying into the whole culture. Because being a division officer or junior officer, you can kind of play both sides a little bit. You can tell your senior enlisted that it's your department heads who are really to blame for, the policies that are being handed down, and you can just kind of act like a middleman, a conduit, because you're still kind of in training. But anyways, so yeah. Anyway, I on the side, I'm kind of learning about other stuff, like not really historical stuff, like foreign policy, so much as like consumer health stuff. Like a lot of people learning about the toxification of our water, of our air, the prevalence of synthetic chemicals in the products that we eat and use. My wife was very integral in that sort of process. She did a lot of research in consumer health and kind of opened my eyes about the ability of regulators to kind of ensure consumer safety. So I was learning about that, and I would say I was going from like a liberal to like ethical consumerist sort of radical, and very still liberal. And this is like 2009, 2010. And I would say in the Naval Academy, I actually learned a lot too. I learned about the things like the 1953 coup in Iran, overthrowing the CIA, overthrowing Mossadegh, which was huge. That was mind-blowing for me. I mean, that was in a course in Middle Eastern history that I learned that, and I learned a lot of other little vignettes, and I was trying to make sense of all this stuff. Like, clearly we're not like a force for good in the world like we say we are. So what are we a force for? Like, what are we doing? Like, why is this such a pattern in our history of overthrowing democratically elected leaders in the third world countries, quote unquote third world countries. So I had no explanation. I only was learning about these little vignettes of our history. And then Occupy happened in 2011, and I was like, heck yeah, we're like, finally, like you're pushing back on, I don't know what, like, finally people are pissed off about something,
Mm-hmm.
Because honestly, I didn't know that in 2003 that it was like an unprecedentedly huge anti-war protest. I had no idea, because obviously Fox News wasn't showing that. I didn't know that anybody was protesting the war. I thought I was alone in objecting to this. I thought, anyway, so in 2011, Occupy happened, and it just felt like, I wanted to be part of it. I was an officer, so it felt very weird for me to go to these protests, but I did go with my wife to a couple of them, and it was kind of towards the end when Occupy was unraveling, and there was just a lot of infighting. So we went to like two of them, and we're like, this is not productive. And that was in San Diego. I was stationed in San Diego, and I think I ended up. Well, my mom sent me a copy of Noam Chomsky's Understanding Power, which is a collection of interviews. And I read that, and it turned my world upside down, like completely, paradigm, just, my head was spinning, because I felt like I finally had an explanation for all these things that, the conventional narratives just weren't adding up. And in addition to that, I read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And again, it just blew my mind that there was this entire history of struggle against the very things that I was becoming uncomfortable with. And it was hugely validating, and it just like set a fire in me, and it made it very hard for me to continue doing my job. I continued reading, from that point on. I've just been just voraciously consuming books and just nonstop reading, and I feel like I've learned more since 2012 than I have, than I had in the previous 30 years, because I was 30 when I read that. So I ended up joining this group called International Organization for Participatory Society. It's a mouthful, but it's basically around Michael Albert Zina, which is like, it's I don't know if you guys have heard of Paricon, but it's basically an organization built around a specific libertarian socialist vision. And so I met some people in that group, and I ended up moving towards anarchism, a specific variant of anarchism, but sort of a class struggle anarchism. And I was still, an officer in the Navy, and I was trying to sort of reconcile a little bit. I knew that I eventually knew that I had to get out of the Navy, because I was either going to get fired or I was going to screw up and, get fired. So I thought about, leaving early, becoming like a conscientious objector, but Stacy and I talked about it, and we just decided to finish out my tour. So the rest of my career was pretty difficult. I ended up, you can't when you're a radical, you can't just sort of sit on your beliefs. So I would end up, talking with people about anarchism and socialism, and I knew the risks that involved. But surprisingly, I was surprised how much I got away with. I'd be on the bridge as the officer of the deck, and I'd be, talking about anarchism for hours on end, and it made for interesting conversation in the middle of the night. I don't know how productive it was to be preaching to sailors, but it passed the time.
What was the reaction? I'm
anyway,
curious.
yeah.
Just
What was that?
What was their reaction?
Well, I would say they were amused. Because I think I guess the thing that surprised me is once I was radicalized, I would be just sort of constantly spouting facts, and they might be surprised by certain facts, but the big ideas, I don't think most enlisted people were very surprised by the idea that, like, for example, the corporate media is propaganda. Like, that was something that was mind-blowing for me, but, these are kids that listen to, they might have heard the song about Don't Believe the Hype, which was actually inspired by Noam Chomsky's work in Manufacturing Consent. A lot of this stuff is just kind of common sense, at least among the working classes. And I think education is sort of like it's a form of inoculation by the ruling class specifically for middle class people like me, to sort of instill us with this mythology. But I don't think that mythology has quite a strong a hold among the working class. At least I was surprised by how common sense some of these ideas were, I guess. But the facts, certain statistics and certain historical events, I think, were interesting and surprising. But I guess I would say most enlisted people, I don't think that most enlisted people believe in the patriotic mythology of the military. I think that's kind of a strong statement, and it would be interesting to see a survey. Of course, surveys are illegal in the military, but it would be interesting to see how much people actually believe. Yeah, so I'm still inspired by Paricon. I agree with a lot of it. I mean, I might have some disagreements, and I think it can get a little bit esoteric, when you start debating certain details of a socialist vision. But I think some parts of it, I do agree with the main point, which is that socialist vision, at an institutional level, I think it's essential to the left, thinking about what is our vision, what are we going after, like what is our rubric for measuring changes in society, So I'm persuaded by that main argument and by most of Paricon vision. But I think where I disagree with Michael Albert is sort of strategically. I think the anarchist thesis that the electoral road is a dead end, I think I tend to think that that's right. I think that we do need to, rather than trying to democratize the state, I think we need to build the institutions on the outside. And I don't mean like cooperatives. I'm thinking more unions. So I would say I come from like the anarcho-syndicalist perspective, which is building unions that will eventually form the basis of a socialist society. Now, there's lots of debates within the anarcho-syndicalists perspective. So, that, I don't know how detailed we want to get, but and I'm also persuaded by tendencies within Marxism. For example, Stoughton Lynd is very influential for me and for a lot of people in the IWW. He wrote that book. He's written a lot of books, but there's one called Labor Law for the Rank and File, and they make a case in that book for something called solidarity unionism.
Who is the author?
And Stoughton Lynd.
Okay.
It's Staughton, and it's Lynd, Lynd. And actually, there's an article in the New York Times recently that talked about the influence that book had on the Google organizing that happened recently, which really surprised me and I found really encouraging. And also among Uber and Lyft drivers. So solidarity unionism is something that's associated with the IWW. But basically the idea is organizing, I would say, in a different way from sort of the NLRB method, which is, you have an election and you gain exclusive bargaining rights. This is sort of I see it as a state-sponsored unionism, and I think it's kind of a trap. It's playing the game on the boss's terms. I think those terms are favorable to the state and therefore the bosses. So I'm sort of, I think solidarity unionism is the way to go. I also think that vision needs to be part of that. We need to be talking, as part of our organizing, we need to be talking about socialism in terms of institutions, and how to get there. There's a tradition in the anarchist movement right now of sort of separating unions and political organizations. So Black Rose, for example, who I like a lot, there's a lot of agreement there. They're like a political organization, and the idea is to start mass organizations that are not anarchist. And I'm persuaded by the perspective of the Argentinian Fora, the FORA, which holds that you can't separate the two. They need to be combined. You need the ideological, political content along with the mass organizing piece. They have to be together.
I guess what I would ask is, when did you first consider yourself a revolutionary? And what about anarchist politics was most essential in cementing that notion of revolution?
I would say I first considered myself a revolutionary after reading those two books. It was pretty rapid transformation at that point. And I had Stacy and I had our first child in that same year, so it was a big year for me, because when you have a child, it changes you a lot, changes your perspective on the world. You feel more responsibility for future generations. I mean, I think you do. I mean, it's hard for me to say. I mean, I think revolutionaries in general do feel responsibility for future generations, but I think, even parents who are not revolutionaries feel, an extra sense of responsibility, because they're going to have, grandkids. Whether that's rational or not, I mean, I think it's true.
Mm-hmm. What would you say was essential in anarchism that really cemented your notion of change and making change against capitalism?
I would say that the critique against authority and hierarchy, it just really resonated with me because of my experience in the military, which is, it's probably the most hierarchical organization in the world. It just, it just clicked. It was like, I feel like I had already come to that conclusion on my own. Although I didn't have an alternative. I think my conclusion was more one of despair and fatalism. Because I didn't think that there was another way. And then learning that, there is another way. We don't have to organize ourselves hierarchically. We can just, work together. And having that experience also as an enlisted sailor, seeing the spirit of cooperation, a non-competitive spirit that is so prevalent among the working class. It made a lot of sense to me, and I really developed a strong thirst for that vision of a world where we just, there are no authorities in the sense of, people who are who are deciding for others. The idea that we can make decisions, democratically, on the basis of an informed consent, it just makes a lot more sense. And, so that was I think that was the part that really drew me in. And I also had a sort of intuitive sense that capitalism was corrosive as well. So that was the socialist part. Because I knew that money, in a very, very similar way to hierarchy, it's basically the same process. You make money by exploiting people. You get promoted by exploiting people. It's the only way to do it. There is no other way. So the two go together in my mind, because I see this the process of capitalist accumulation and domination. I see it as very, very much related processes.
You've given us very good, substantial wealth of information about your personal journey, and I'm thinking you even didn't even need questions. You did quite well in your experience, even chronologically, to outlining your military experience, which we'll delve into, as we have said, into another episode.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how far you want to take this.
I have this. I'm curious about the anarchism, so I'm going to go into it a little bit more. Can you speak about some of your experiences actually organizing in organizations that identify as anarchist and revolutionary anarchists? What were those experiences? What was positive about them, and what didn't work? Because I've had my experiences that were positive, and as organizing as revolutionary socialist, things that educated me, but then things that definitely did not work that got me out. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point to bring up. I think, what drew me to anarchism initially was the sort of classical anarchism, reading people like Emma Goldman and Enrico Malatesta and Bakunin, people who are part of the syndicalist anarchism of the First International, which Marx was also a part of, and anarchism that grew out of a political disagreement, mainly between Bakunin and Marx and their followers. So that classical, and eventually I came to realize that the culture of modern anarchism is kind of, I saw it as somewhat antisocial. I was never a part of the punk rock culture, and I'm still not. And I don't want to generalize too much, because I think there it's not everybody, but it's going to some of these spaces. It just feels very cold and sort of like lifestylist. I guess it's just sort of a way of capturing it, but I don't know if it's the best way. But it's this subculture, like the punk rock anarchist subculture. I just find it very alienating, and I think that's also just part of like the consumerist culture of the United States. Probably, I mean, it's not endemic to anarchism necessarily, but maybe it is. I don't know. But I also think that anarchism has a very problematic history that probably should be acknowledged more. Like Bakunin flirted with sort of a version of insurrectionism within his relationship with Sergei Nechayev, who was kind of a shady person. And this idea of creative destruction, I think Bakunin, I don't think he was much of an insurrectionist, but there's something there. And, there's people like Alexander Berkman trying to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, which is extremely counterproductive. Sacco and Vanzetti were both insurrectionists, good-hearted people, but just in terms of strategic thinking, insurrectionism, assassinations, bombings, and that sort of individualist attacks, it's just not a good idea. It's incredibly counterproductive. And I think that sort of maybe antisocial side of anarchism is some baggage that is still it's associated with the word, so it kind of follows the movement a little bit. And so, when you talk about anarchism in the United States, it's such a huge range of perspectives. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at. And in Occupy, I saw some of those sort of tendencies that, like the local anarchists in San Diego, wanting to. It was just very alienating. The behavior was alienating. Just very quick to denounce rather than trying to engage people in productive, constructive dialogue. I think it's important to critique your own kind of milieu, and it's really the only milieu that I'm familiar with. I haven't been part of ISO or anything else, and I know those milieus have their own problems. Mm-hmm. But one thing I see in anarchism is it's reflective of the liberal activist culture too. It's just sort of like if you have a disagreement with somebody, call out culture, that sort of thing. We just don't know how to disagree with each other and maintain friendly relations. I think the culture of debate, the intellectual culture, is just kind of, it's not really present in the left, the ability to disagree constructively. So we either blow up at each other and split, or we pretend like we agree about things when we don't really agree. I think those are the things that I critique about anarchist culture today. But thankfully, I like to think that is changing, as evidenced by the Black Rose Anarchist Federation, which is sort of more formal, organized anarchism, which I think means a little bit more commitment to each other, which kind of forces you to be in each other's presence and be able to disagree. If you want to be part of the movement, you can't just kind of start your own clique. So I appreciate that trend in the anarchist movement.
Can you I have a friend, or a friend of ours, one of the people we interviewed down in L.A. Around the strike. She is connected to people who are operate within the Black Rose Collective. Can you say a little bit more about them? Because I don't think many of us know much about them, about this group.
Okay. Well, I'm not a member of Black Rose, so I don't want to speak too much. But as far as I know that they're inspired by the FAU of Uruguay, the Federación Anarquista de Uruguay. I think that's what it is. Which is, it's a specific variant called especificismo. That's the term that FAU gave to their sort of variant of anarchism, which is it's a class struggle anarchism, and I think the emphasis is that we've lost our social vector, so we can't just be propaganda groups. We need to have social movements, because that is sort of like the medium of ideological transmission is through social movements. And that part I fully agree with. Is when you get into nitty-gritty details of how to do that, I think where I have issues, I'm affiliated with WSA, which is Workers' Solidarity Alliance, been around since the 80s, and anyway, there's lots of differences within the anarchist movement. I would say WSA and Black Rose are extremely close, but for whatever reason, I don't know that I can explain it. I would say WSA is more oriented towards workplace organizing, whereas Black Rose is generally defined it as social movement organizing. I think it ends up being the same thing, because when you're talking about social movements, unless you're talking about that activist subculture, then you're talking about either housing organizing or workplace organizing, or maybe feminist organizing. There's other possibilities there, but usually you're going to talk about one of those two spheres of society. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, would you maybe then just talk more specifically about then WSA, if that's what you've been involved in and your experiences there?
Okay. So WSA has been around since the 1980s. I don't know exactly when it was founded. Workers' Solidarity Alliance. There was a process of rapprochement back in 2013, 2014, I want to say, where all of the sort of class struggle anarchist groups around the United States were talking about forming one big organization. And WSA and another group, First of May Anarchist Alliance, were part of those talks. That process of rapprochement ended up resulting in Black Rose for various reasons that I'm not familiar enough with to explain. WSA did not end up merging with Black Rose. I think it's because of I think part of it was just semantic difference with people in Black Rose at the time were insisting on the use of communism, and people in WSA had issues with that. I think that was the problem, but I'm not totally sure. People who are part of that could probably speak better to that. Anyways, but WSA is a friend of it's called Friend Status, affiliate of the IWA, which was founded in 1920s in the anarcho-syndicalist tradition. And so it has sections in Czechoslovakia, England, Germany. IWA International Workers Association. So the same idea as the first international founded in 1864 that Marx and Bakunin were both part of. Same basic idea. Form unions and overthrow the capitalist system. Yeah, so WSA is part of that. WSA, lost a lot of members in that process of forming what became Black Rose. So I think we're in the process of kind of reconstructing. And the important thing for me is, not the organizational loyalty, but just that we get the ideas out there. I kind of wish that there was a little bit more open discussion and debate amongst various, class struggle anarchists. I'm just not seeing enough of that. I just wish there were a lot more of everything, more activity, more discussion. But, it's coming. I'm sure they're working on it.
And like I've had, and when I was in an organization, we had branch meetings and elected leadership. What are some of the structures, and then what are some of the things on any given day or any given week or month you all try to do?
I just recently kind of joined the WSA in a sort of more committed form. So I want to emphasize the fact that it's in the process of reconstruction. So activity. Membership is extremely small. Activity is really small. And there's committees that are having talks that I'm not part of, so I probably shouldn't talk too much more about WSA specifically, because I'm not an insider, much of an insider.
Okay.
I don't want to make any misrepresentations.
Yeah.
I like that you're careful.
I know.
I like that you're very careful, though. I appreciate that. We're not speculating here. And if you are speculating, you say so, which is great.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Eduardo's talking to me through you right now.
You use words like, I'm not a part of this, so I want to state this. I want to emphasize this. It is great. It is great. You clearly state out when you are going to delve into speculation.
So, thank you, Eduardo. And I agree with him. I do agree with him. I can learn some lessons from you and Eduardo. Anyhow, so the historical. The biggest theoretical divide that I see exists between anarchists and socialists, revolutionary ones at least, is the notion of the idea of the worker state. That this transitional state that socialists believe will need to be constructed. That's why dual power is important. That's why workers' councils are important. And it will need to be a repressive one that is able to repress the capitalists who are trying to take their stuff back, and then obviously be the basis for expanding a revolution, a working class revolution abroad internationally, not through repression, but through collaboration, through the collaborations of this new worker state where working class democracy is central, I do believe. But so where do you or where do anarchists where do you fit in regard to that part of that debate?
Well, I as far as the idea of the worker state, obviously we have to get into historical debates about, how it played out in practice. And there's a book, you may have come across it, called, or I don't know if it's a book, but a pamphlet maybe. It's called The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control by Chris Pallas, a.k.a. Maurice Brenton.
Not that one of that.
And have you guys read that one? Or?
No, I haven't.
Anyway, Chris Pallas, it was written in the 1960s, I think, at a time when, Leninism was the prevailing ideology. well, I guess it may still be, but he was part of a group called Solidarity, which was, I would say it was Marxist, like libertarian Marxist, which I think I really like looking at perspectives like that, because I think it's like I said earlier, the categories can be like destructive. Like fences are for dogs. Dogs will fight each other over a fence, whereas if the fence weren't there, then they wouldn't be fighting each other.
Yeah.
So anyway, that book talks about how the worker state played out in practice, and I think in talking with my other friends who are Trotskyists, I think there's a tendency to sort of explain the regression of the Soviet state in terms of like the effects of the Civil War, or the differing interests between the peasantry and the workers, and I in the USSR I see the problem as basically being the merging of the left with the state. I see the state as an inherently repressive body, and unavoidable maintainer of class. I also happen to be influenced by a new, fairly new idea, which is that there is no politics in economics. There is only the system. You can't really draw a distinction between capital and the state, because the state. Anyways, there's a book called Capital as Power, and I happen to be hugely persuaded by that, and other people who have said this too, that there's no difference between politics and economics, and I see class not as a solely economic relation between workers and the bourgeoisie, or the owners of the means of production, but as a relation of domination, which includes the workers and the bosses, but also includes the state that kind of guarantees that relation. So I think you can't just abolish one side and then expect the other side to wither away. I think it's all part of it's all a relation of domination, and as long as that relation is sort of not opposed by the left, I think we have to maintain a position of opposition against the state. In other words, I guess I'm kind of dancing around the issue, but when it comes to self-defense, I don't know. I guess I don't have too much to say about the military question. About I'm just not persuaded by the idea that we need. I do think that the revolution has to be kind of a global thing that has to be. It's going to have to be in stages, and like we're going to have to win reforms that kind of weaken the claws of the state, if you will. Because if you try to have a revolution in one country, then the capitalist class are going to strangle you. Kind of what's happening with Rojava. Unfortunately, as much as I want to see that project succeed, it feels like the odds are stacked so highly against them with being surrounded by hostile powers, and the movement not really hardly even existing anywhere else to kind of undermine the forces of imperialism. the military question. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I have two questions. You said, well, just you said the military. I want to ask you. We talked about how the military is mostly composed of the working class. Do you see any value in it in the revolution to essentially shift their allegiance?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and I actually had the idea of trying to organize sort of a secret cell, but I didn't have the guts to do it, and I didn't feel like I had this. I didn't feel like I had the. I mean, you need a more of a support group if you're going to try to start something like that, and I was pretty much on my own, and I don't think anybody would have supported that idea anyway, even if I had a group, because it's such a risky endeavor. I mean, I don't know the legality surrounding that, but I'm pretty sure I could be, taking the Leavenworth or something. So yeah, I definitely think that that's something that should be done. I mean, it would be great. I always think to myself, if I had met somebody, who was tabling or pamphleting or something, I would have been a radical so much earlier. But I never met anybody, and I definitely think we got to get out there more. But we got to try to put our ideas out there more actively. I think we partly lack confidence in ourselves to persuade people of our ideas. Partly because our ideas are kind of crappy, because they're kind of ossified. Like, not, the language is ossified, it's outdated. We need to kind of update the ideas. Like, there's a really strong element of determinism in our ideas, in Marxism. And I should point out that Bakunin was a Marxist. And most anarchism is basically Marxist, even though it had objections to particular pieces. The overall economic sort of framework was generally accepted by most, not all, and so maybe to a lesser extent, but the determinism piece, I think, needs to be rejected. And the distinction between ideas and action, Marx turned Hegel on his head by saying that the material world precedes the ideological one. I think that's a false dichotomy. Ideas are part of the material world. We need to merge those together in our understanding and merge ideas with practice, and not be ashamed of the sort of philosophical parts of not be ashamed of the philosophical work, because that part is really important. And I don't mean like navel-gazing philosophy, but like, real constructive philosophy.
When you talk about philosophizing, you mean to debate, to constructively think out things through, but to essentially use that revolutionary on the ground in the real world.
Yeah. Like I guess for me, like if I just imagined that Noam Chomsky was an organizer, Noam Chomsky has said that he wishes he were a better organizer. He's a terrible organizer, and he thinks people should be organizing. So we should just listen to that and sort of take the things, the ideological piece, which he's good at, and which many of us are good at, and bring that to our organizing. Be willing to talk about, and we also need to establish the spaces for that. Like the same sort of dichotomy exists in the union movement, whereas we have this idea that the union should be a sort of a politically neutral vehicle for revolutionaries to steer. and I think that's sort of a contradictory idea. We need to establish revolutionary unions, so sort of like the IWW, but here's the thing about the IWW. Since 1905, it has straddled the question of the state and refused to kind of resolve one way or the other. And though it's been dominated by anarchists, since then, that question, I think it played a more destructive role in the 1920s. Disintegration of the IWW, because I think it played a bigger role in that process than the World War I era repression did, honestly. I think that factor, that sort of that habit of avoiding big questions, important questions, is a very destructive habit in the left. We need to debate these things. We can't avoid important questions. And even anarchists in the IWW will say, no, we shouldn't have that. That's for political organization. This is a union. We need the union to be for all workers. And so I think you're just kind of like, you're wanting to eat your cake and have it too, in a way. Anyway, I'm really digressing here.
Yeah.
You have another question?
I did. I'm curious about you having said something about reforms and how you think it has to be gradual, or you said stage by stage. Could you expand on that? You don't think a revolution should be siege a momentum and go full out?
This is something that I kind of struggle with personally, so it's just, I flip-flop all the time, but the perspective that I've kind of come to have is, I guess I'm like, I consider myself sort of a reformist in that I think we need to be aiming for overall abolition of private property and the state, but I think we need to be. I don't think that you can. Obviously, you can't campaign for that right now. If you go and try to hit the streets campaigning for abolition of private property, it's like nobody's going to listen to you, because we just don't have that kind of power right now. I think we have to build the power, and in order to have the power, we need to be trying to win reforms along that trajectory. So 30-hour work week, which I think the AFL-CIO is coming out with a report calling for a 30-hour work week. That would be a great thing to jump on if it ends up, being a thing. Those sort of things. Shorter, better working conditions, more regulations. I think we should be, struggling for social democratic sort of, gains, but we also, in that process, we need to be constantly saying, this is not enough. It's the problems are going to remain until we go all the way. So I guess in that sense, I would consider myself sort of a reformist. I think the distinction is not, the important distinction for me is not between reformism and revolutionism, but between like how you win the reforms. So like a lot of times we refer to electoral campaigns as reformist. To me, the flaw is not in trying to get, Medicare for all. I think that's something we should be struggling for, but we shouldn't be, as the electoral method is misguided. I think we should be campaigning directly for Medicare for all, in the form of a social movement that doesn't kind of premise it on this one sort of savior guy like Bernie Sanders. nothing against him personally. I just think that we're setting ourselves up for failure.
So that I was going to ask, in light of Eduardo's question, what your attitude towards people, the Democratic Socialists of America, Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez. What's your attitude about that movement, where many people see the future of socialism in that through that?
I think it's encouraging to see such a big movement for things like Medicare for All, and to see somebody like Sanders leading the polls, which I hope that's true. I think it's true. I think it's a good thing, but my concern is, if Sanders wins, what is going to happen? Are we going to quiet down like normally happens? Because that's normally the pattern: is we win an election and the movement is gone. And if he loses, it's going to have a demoralizing effect, because people won't really know where to go, because people think the power is in the state when the power is in our own hands, if we get together, but only if we get together. And I think there's sort of there's also a rise of a labor movement. I think people are seeing the power of the strike, so maybe maybe the momentum will continue. Whether he wins or loses, it seems like it's going to be. It seems like the momentum is going to continue in some way, and I hope that's true. But I think we have to push. We're going to have to we got to put it out there. Like, this is how we win, by organizing, striking, using the power that we have, those sort of things. Like Howard Zinn said, it's not who's sitting in office, it's who's sitting in. I think that's the most succinct way of capturing the anarchist thesis that I can think of. So the danger that I see in DSA is in the idea that the left can merge with the state. I think the left in power is kind of a dangerous thing, because the left on the ground ends up the left has to keep pushing. And if the left is sort of like not opposing the president or whoever because it's one of our guys, then we've already compromised our values. And that's what I see as an inherent part of the electoral strategy, the state strategy, is once we get our guy in office, whatever office that is, we're supposed to support them. And I don't think we should ever take the heat off. I don't think we should ever let up on our demands, no matter who's in office. Now, that's not to say that we should treat everyone the same. I mean, obviously Trump deserves more heat than Sanders does, and I think there's a way to say that Sanders is the better candidate, and when you vote for the lesser evil. I think the lesser evil voting I think it's important and worthy. I don't think it's everything. I think what matters is that we're using popular power. So yeah, the danger that I see in DSA is the same danger that I see in the Democratic Party and even in the revolutionary left, which is the idea that the left can be in power. I say that when the left is in power, it's not the left. And I think that's something that Michael Hart and Antonio Negri say too, that there is no left in government. The left can't be in government. It's not the left anymore if it's in government, because the relation is one of domination.
Maybe then, could you say then there are those who would imagine some road to revolution that leads through the left challenging state power under a capitalist, when it's a capitalist state, and they think there's a connection there between the but we'll still say that an insurrection is necessary to ultimately take that state down, and in the socialist case, build a worker state as a transition. From your vantage point, what is your notion of how that, even in the foggiest sense of how that, how would we get to that revolution that you think we're going to need?
Well, unlike a lot of people refer to the Spanish Revolution, I really hesitate to refer to that because it's such a hugely different context that we're in. The Spanish Revolution happened. Well, it's just a hugely different context. I mean, it happened in the course of a sort of a right-wing rebellion, fascist rebellion, and I mean, it was kind of, although it was incredibly inspiring, it was kind of doomed given the circumstances, probably. And I can't say that I would have done anything differently, but I guess I think we are going to have to pass through, social democracy and maybe like centrally planned socialism. But I think we need to kind of keep pushing. In other words, just basically keep pushing. I'm not sure that it can happen in sort of like a very, very short amount of time where like, basically we go from like this incredibly like super capitalist system that we have now to a libertarian social, like full communism or libertarian socialism, same thing in my mind. I think that the more that you persuade people of the socialist ideas, the more society is going to reflect, the more society's institutions are going to reflect those ideas. And right now we're extremely marginalized. We haven't persuaded hardly anybody of our ideas, and I think the more that socialist ideals prevail, which they're beginning to come back, the more they prevail, the more we're going to see these institutions kind of go in a socialistic direction, which is to say, not law and order, but providing for people.
Maybe now, because this has been very useful, and I think this is, if anybody who's listening to this, I hope they do listen to it. If they want to hear about the military part that you're going to talk about next time, I feel like this stuff you said is very important for them to have an understanding of your framework. I do think I'll do this, which is maybe, because you said a lot, and I think we haven't really got a chance to say what we think about it. Maybe we'll say some thoughts about it, and then you can finish up after we speak, because you've said so many things, it's made me think about some things. So I'll tell you the two biggest things that I've heard from you that really left an impact on me. One is the description you made of the military, where people who moved up to higher levels of officerness became, they kind of had to do things.
Yeah.
To me, this is how I understand management under public education, to be honest. This very much carries into the debate of having our own site over whether we should be even challenging our principle. And I feel like if you're going to have any kind of movement, revolutionary movement or not, it has to, because those people are not ours, they're theirs. So the description you made of the military, to me, is completely what I understand management under capitalism. It's just maybe a hyper version of that. Although I'm not sure it is a hyper version of it. I think it is just what it is. You have to basically do the job of the boss, even if you don't want to, if you want to advance. And that was one big thing.
And I agree.
Yeah. And the other thing, and this is possible, well, this is not just possibly, is that I heard what you said about these institutions, these capitalist institutions that you experienced in the military, but then you experience elsewhere. They force a logic on everyone, and that is probably where I do feel like it's going to have to be a fairly rapid change. That it's not going to be convincing people. Of course, we want to convince people of socialist or radical ideas, but that those ideas will not be powerful enough unless we are organized to shatter the institutions that exist, the institutional framework that exists. And that is one thing that I really agreed with what you stated, that we are essentially, whether we're on the top or on the bottom, are forced into it. And maybe one of the last things for me was when you spoke of how you, as a kind of patriotic person, were in that position to it was almost your patriotism which made the actions of your country that much more dissonant, which caused you to kind of like be like, what the hell's going on? Like, this doesn't, that really resonated with me, because in some ways I thought I was cynical, but I wasn't clearly cynical enough as the United States government was. And when I realized how cynical they were, that just propelled me into manufacturing consent, reading that, and reading People's History of the United States, and I was just like, that changed my world, essentially. And so that's an interesting notion. And the idea that workers like already get it at some level, you know, like there's nothing. They were kind of amused at your radicalism because it was that resonated with me as well. But I don't think the absence for them is this notion that the world is constructed in this completely unfair way. But I do think they are like almost amused, or even like, what are you talking about? We can't change this. Like, I think that, for me, that's what underlies people's is like, that's amusing that you think you can change it. How cute, you know, like, because this is how it is. I've been bred and built into this thing, and it's just the way it is. So it's funny that you're saying these things. I agree with you, but it's a joke to think you're going to change them. Those are some things that went through my mind as you were talking.
I think I'm left with a lot of questions, Will. I think I would like to ask those questions when we talk on part two. Two things for me that I was left with on your journey, your political journey. One, here in San Francisco, especially, the liberal left constantly demonizes the military. Demonizes the military, and I think that if revolutionaries want to really create something out here in the world, they really will have to hone in. They will have to really reach out to the military to build that bridge with the military instead of seeing them as part of the state. So I think that's the one area where the left has not seen the military as part of their struggle as well. Because they are working class people. They do target people that are in schools that are not doing well, students that do feel disenfranchised, students that feel that they have been given up by the system, or just that we're just not seeing them that way. And I think that's the missing piece. I think that the people on the left have to work on. And secondly, when you mentioned about how if you had some pamphlet or some piece of information to you that you would have radicalized a lot earlier, I thought to myself, sometimes I keep to myself some of my own evolution, some of my own understanding of of politics and my own ideas. And I think sometimes we maybe don't, or maybe we're just resigned, or there's an apathy out there that exists within us that we think that people, I'll speak for myself, I think maybe people don't really care anymore. Yeah. And we just don't know what's out there that's untapped that we can reach to, the people that we can reach to.
Andy, what you were saying about the principles, I totally agree with that, and I see sort of like a collaborationist tendency in the teachers movement to not want to oppose principals or even superintendents sometimes. It's almost like the battle lines are drawn between like a public school and charter schools, which I think is I think it's the wrong line to be drawing. I don't know if that's a prevailing tendency, but it is certainly one tendency. But I think, and drawing battle lines is maybe not the best thing to do anyway, but I think that organizing among the lower ranks is essential, because those are the most amenable to socialistic ideas, because they're the most sort of disenfranchised. And then, Eduardo, what you were saying about the military, I totally agree with that. And I almost feel like people are more willing to concede that point, that we need to be, obviously it has to be done carefully. You don't want to say, oh, we love our military, join, whatever radical organization. You don't want to glorify the sort of role that they have. You want to attack the role without attacking the person.
Mm-hmm.
And one, this is very controversial to say it, and I know people will disagree, but I think the same is true of the police. The police, I see them as a counterinsurgency force. They're a domestic counterinsurgency force. They're basically the same role as the military. And I think people are more willing to see the military as sort of potential recruits to the radical left. You've got people like, what's his name, the West Point cadet, who's, similar trajectory as mine. I think people are more willing to concede that, but it's like some of the rhetoric about the police, I don't think it's very productive. I think it's kind of sort of cheering for our side kind of thing. Like it's understandable when repressed communities, use terms like pigs and stuff like that, or ACAB. And it's completely understandable, but that doesn't mean that it's the most productive sort of tack to be taking. You know what I mean? Ultimately, we want sort of people on the inside who are going to maybe organize underground and say, put down their weapons, during a protest rather than shooting at the crowd. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think we're kind of too attached to sort of like beating our chest and saying, oh, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, instead of just putting our ideas out there and especially among what I call the buffer control strata, which is middle classes and includes the military and the police. I think we're undermining the power of the state really means going after those segments that are more controlling and repressive. Sort of undermining those ideologies. If you look at the response of the evangelicals to the betrayal of the Kurds, they really pulled the rug out from under Trump by going after him because he betrayed the Kurds. It's like I feel like if we kind of like went after the sort of ideological entrenchment of those segments of the population, it would do a lot of harm to it would be a very productive step in the process of taking the claws out of the state and therefore of capital.
Interesting. So I think we're mostly done here.
Yeah.
Do you have any last comments you want to share? Because we're gonna obviously we're gonna do this again. We're gonna get a little more dive more deeply into your military experience and questions I just have about how the military kind of runs. But is there anything else you want to share with us or people who might be listening about your journey or where you are right now?
No. No, thanks for letting me ramble for a couple of hours. Really appreciate it.
I'm going to say right now, anyone who's continuing to listen to this is on the road to becoming a revolutionary because you understand how important it is to watch somebody struggle and how somebody develop. I just think it's a very important thing for people to understand how people change. That's what this movement's going to be about, is people changing. And anybody who said, oh, this is boring, blah, 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 blah. F you don't even know how change is going to come about. Sorry, I'm gotta say that. Everyone here is already listening. The people who stopped listening, I just
I see. I see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's hugely important, and it's ignored. Like, people who, like, a lot of the movement is just posturing and sort of being self-gratifying in our virtuosity instead of thinking. It's like, I think a revolution is pedagogy. And as teachers, you guys are both teachers. You understand that it's like, you may have all the right information. You may be, you may understand quantum physics, but you may also be a shitty teacher. And that's true of revolutionaries too. Like, if you may have read all the books and you may get it, like, conceptually, but if your attitude isn't right, you're a shitty revolutionary.
Yep.
You have to care about the people that you're talking. You have to care about your audience. You have to consider where they are, and when we get on our soapbox, we have to be careful about the posture that we take, I think, and we have to consider the audience.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah. Another lecture from me about
all right, thank you guys.
He loves conservatives.
I do. I get along better with conservatives.
Yeah, I think coming from a conservative background, you have a better idea of what it takes to persuade people. And I guess the flip side is true too. Like, sometimes we get frustrated with the left.
Yeah.
It really is the same deal.
It is.
And I think the best model that I know of for persuading people, is like Noam Chomsky. Like, the way he comes at questions, he's very much fact-based. He's very circumspect in his answers. No question is sort of like, he doesn't scoff at questions for the most part. I think he's a good model to kind of emulate for, like, how to be like a what I call a world teacher, socialist teacher.
All right.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
All right.
We're going to conclude the episode now, so just to remind our listeners and viewers, our new listeners and viewers, where they can find us. Thank you. This concludes our episode with Will, and stay tuned for episode 2, and we will be uploading up on any of our 5 platforms. You can find us on any of our 5 platforms on YouTube, Stitcher, Bitchute, Google Play, or iTunes Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and best of all, share with your family and friends. And that's it. Thank you very much, Will, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me again.
All right. We'll do this again.
Ciao.